Welcome to the Afterthoughts of Hotel Bar Sessions, where we get together and talk about the things we said right, the things we said wrong, the things we should have said. In this episode of Afterthoughts, we're going to be talking about episode 49 on memory, episode 50 on desire, and episode 51 on moral subjectivity. So let's start with desire. No, let's start with memory. I mean, we always start with desire, but I desire to start talking
God,
about memory.
that is still
So,
so Lovecraftian with the tail just coming into the frame.
Charles, any afterthoughts about memory?
Well, one thing, I enjoyed the conversation, but one thing I wish that I had sort of explored more were the effects or the results of, I guess, what I would call being trapped in a memory. I'm being unable to escape a particular sort of constructed moment within one's timeline, or even to expand that to a group, how some groups get trapped into a particular sort of thought of themselves and their history and what that means for them, and how that may limit the ability to evolve, to grow, to change. I know we talked about the Toni Morrison, which suggested ways by which certainly African-American consciousness through the whole process of rememory can escape the possibility of that, right? We talked about Beloved and the character of Setha finally moving past the traumas of enslavement. But what about those individuals or those groups that can't do that? And I kind of wish we had, I wish we had dug into that a little bit more.
Lee, you have any afterthoughts about memory?
Yeah, but before that, I just want to echo what Charles said, because I think that that's a really good point, and I hadn't thought about the fact that we really skipped over entirely the ways that memories can be, pathological in a way, and actually really impede our progress as persons and societies and communities. So yeah, I think that's a really good point. I think for me, maybe the one thing that stuck out when I was listening back to it was our maybe a little bit of an overemphasis on the relationship between memory and individual, like personal identity. I know that for me, that was a really important question, and it in some ways got in the way of talking about other things, like the point that Charles just brought up, which is hugely important. But I think also, we didn't really talk a lot about body memory. That memory is not an entirely cognitive process. And I know that Charles at one point in the episode mentioned smells, and we all know the relationship between memories and smells, but even just muscle memory, those sorts of things that are not the usual way that we think about memory as being like I said, a sort of cognitive operation.
Well, that makes me think, how much of our lives is muscle memory? Like getting in a car, starting up, driving to your job. I mean, how much of our lives have just sort of hardwired certain actions into such a deep sort of somatic level, right? That it's not even conscious anymore. The stuff that we do, the things that we sort of, how we engage in certain situations.
And that example is interesting because when I used to drive to my job, there would be days when I would get in the car and I wasn't going to work, and all of a sudden I find myself halfway to work because I just hadn't been thinking about it. But I mean, this goes back to, and I this will be the only thing I'll say about the memory episode, is I completely blundered, and I corrected it in the show notes, but I attributed to Hobbes something that in fact starts with Plato, namely this memory as wax idea. But I think what I was trying to get at was strangely this kind of point, that if we think about memory on the model of impression, then something can be impressed on me without my being aware of it. And then it is a material thing that might affect my other decisions, behaviors, and so on. But it happens without any kind of intentionality, without any kind of even recollection or acknowledgement of it. Yeah,
and I think we actually used an example like this in a previous episode. I know we were talking about the muscle memory that's involved in playing an instrument, for example, and we made this distinction between the muscle memory of, for example, playing a C chord and the remembering which notes are in a C chord and where your fingers go on the string in order to do that. So it seems like even when we casually talk about the difference between memory as a cognitive operation and memory as a kind of embodied corporeal material operation, that we can make those distinctions. We can say, my body remembers things that I don't remember. Clearly in the second instance, using memory as a sort of a recollection, a cognitive function. So yeah, I mean, maybe this will be an entirely different episode, but maybe sometime we should talk about what that other kind of memory really is and how it works.
Well, I think about a great line from James Baldwin's Evidence of Things Not Seen, his final essay about the Atlanta child murders of the 70s and 80s. And he's got a great line in terms of talking about identifying with the experience of being a terrified Black child in America, like the children in Atlanta and his own upbringing in Harlem. And he says, my memory stammers, but my soul is a witness. And that's always like an amazing sort of sense. And that's an amazing way of thinking about certain types of things that are just so deeply embedded in our consciousness.
Mm-hmm.
So moving on, episode 50, we talked about desire. Lee, you have any thoughts about
I actually
desire?
think that you should start on this one, Rick. This was your episode.
I have to, in listening back, a couple of things I do want to raise again. I really appreciate, Lee, your raising the introduction of the distinction between appetite and desire. And I went back to Spinoza. And in fact, in Spinoza, the distinction is not all that stark. So the sentence in which he makes the distinction actually begins with, appetite and desire are the same, except that desire is an appetite along with consciousness or being conscious. And this is a total aside here, but I just want to mark that Spinoza uses infrequently but in important places this word conscious in the ethics, and it is completely under-thematized by him in the ethics, and not very many commentators raise what exactly this thing called consciousness is. And so I thought that was interesting as well. And that may have been an opportunity to lead us into a point Lee made late in that episode, which I wish had been an even larger theme, and that is the ideological manipulation of desire.
I mean, that is interesting to hear that Spinoza didn't quite articulate it the way that I said that he did, but I do think that even in our normal everyday understanding, we can make that distinction between an appetite and the awareness of the appetite. And I think desire might be a good word for that. Sorry.
And if I may, Lee, I should have said this. You moved us beyond Spinoza's distinction, and that's totally fine, because you uncovered some really important ground about the reappetization of desire, which I think was a really important moment.
Yeah, that's what I was sort of moving to. I mean, I think I had not really thought that before our conversation. And again, guys, one of the things I love about doing this podcast with you guys is that sometimes things come up and then I listen back to the episode and I'm like, hey, that was a pretty good idea I had. Like, I would never have thought that had I not been in that conversation with you. But I have thought about that a lot since. And I do think that, I think in my working through that idea at the time, that what I was trying to say is that this is what we see in capitalism, is that capitalism sort of takes our desires and tries to turn them back into appetites. And there, I think then the idea that I maybe misappropriated to or misattributed to Spinoza is still very useful, right? Is that this distinction between appetites that we are aware of and that we understand as our own desires And as opposed to the sort of manufactured desires or the manipulated desires or the, ideologically implanted desires that we get from capitalism that we experience not as desires, but as appetites.
I think I had a point that I that's connected to that in terms of the distinction between sort of conscious desires and I guess what we can call unconscious desires. And I started thinking, to embrace desire as something that is a move toward like a fuller realization of the self, right? That sort of unconscious desire sort of has this particular agenda. It has this purpose within sort of like one's existence that conscious, willful, intentional desires just don't have, which may be a little bit more short-sighted. So I like the idea. I wish I'd have thought of it then. Obviously, this is why we have afterthoughts. But but I like the idea that there's something functioning from whatever source, for you, Rick, maybe metaphysically, right? that spurs a desire that has this sort of idea or has this sort of this place where sort of human subjectivity can be. And desire, a safer way of thinking about desire as opposed to the skeptical way that sort of so many philosophers, how they approach it.
Yeah, I mean, I think that one of the problems with turning our desires back into appetites is that for lack of a better word, it sort of biologizes, right, the phenomenon, so that we have a tendency to think that there's no kind of voluntaristic intervention we can really have in that. It's just like, if I'm thirsty, I'm thirsty. If I'm hungry, I'm hungry. If I'm tired, I'm sleepy, like that's just the way that this animal functions. And so I think that in the episode, this is what I was saying that capitalism does. It sort of turns some of our desires back into appetites as a myth that we're told so that we don't get out of line. And in many ways, I think that does echo the myth of the metals from Plato's Republic. But I think not doing that, so the opposite of that would be turning appetites into desires. I think what we see is that religions, frequently do that, turn appetites and desires, so that there is a kind of voluntaristic intervention that you can have in them, and therefore, you can be credited or blamed for having those desires, not appetites, but desires, because there must be some will in there that you're either refusing to exercise or exercising poorly.
I desire the wrong kind of pleasure, therefore I'm going to hell.
Right. Exactly.
And to have your sort of your desire sort of reframed, as George Clinton said, mind your wants because somebody wants your mind.
Yeah, right.
So then finally we're going to
I still think after that episode that desire is too messy a topic for me to frequently engage.
But then let me just say quickly about that. For me, desire then fits in with comedy in the sense that what becomes interesting to me is that they are both of them are resistant to philosophical analysis. And therefore, I'm interested in why so many philosophers are tempted to provide an analysis of them.
Yeah.
Well
said.
So the last then episode we're going to talk about is episode 51, Moral Subjectivity. Lee, you were in the hot seat for that one. What are you thinking about now afterwards?
So in sum, I think that had Nietzsche listened to this podcast, which he definitely would have, were he alive, that he would have been utterly unsurprised by both of your responses to everything. And I think, in the midst of it, I was so concerned about actually walking through the argument of section 13 that I might have missed in many ways how your responses and your resistances to what Nietzsche was saying there were evidence of exactly the argument that he's trying to lay out there. And this is not like like something that I'm like blaming anybody for. I'm just like saying that this is the case. And I know, Rick, this later comes up later in this season of Hotel Bar Sessions, but I know Rick was really concerned about the fact that, it seemed like Nietzsche was putting forward and metaphysics that, as in his words, he found very suspect. But I think that even you're trying to show the ways that it is suspect are entirely kind of situated in the metaphysics that is necessary in order for what Nietzsche calls popular morality to reign supreme. So, yeah, I mean, I suppose, well done, Nietzsche. is my final point on that.
If I could slip in here before we come to you, Charles, I have to say that in all honesty, both having that conversation and then listening to it back several times, I find that episode one of the most frustrating ones that I participated in. And I find it frustrating for two reasons. The first reason is, as I said in that episode, like I bid on something that wasn't really the issue, and I couldn't see my way out of that. And that was frustrating for me. But, Lee, at the end of that episode, you came around to state the position that I was trying to get at, but did not use these terms. And I think to a certain extent, Charles was also getting at, namely, the very description of predators and prey, and therefore the move between strength and weakness, is already a value that I don't hold when it comes to morality. And therefore nothing that Nietzsche says follows for me, because the values, i.e. strength, let's just start there, I simply don't hold as a value. And so then the rest of it doesn't follow. Now, that being said, the other
can I just interrupt really quick? Yeah. I mean, you clearly do hold strength as a value. And you'd even hold it as a value that can be contrasted to another value that you call weakness, right? I mean, I think that what you're saying is that how Nietzsche values that value is something that you don't share, right?
I would say it's a value instrumentally, and so I want to hear what the context is.
Yeah.
And no matter what kind of strength it is, it just depends on what the context is. And so for me, it's not a value full stop. It's a value, I have two sections of fence that have been sitting in my backyard, old fence, that I need to chop up and move, and I need physical strength in order to do that. And then it's a value, but otherwise it's not.
But when we put this in the context of the argument that Nietzsche was making in section 13, where, I mean, ultimately, just to summarize, his claim is going to be that popular morality makes it possible to turn what he calls actual strength, but we can just use physical strength actual weakness into moral strength. I mean, I think that, we can clearly give examples. Examples that I think all three of us here would hold up as admirable and morally admirable, of people who were able to turn physical weakness into moral strength.
But already there already is a value put on the table that I would never analyze that moral admirability using either the term strength or weakness.
That's fine, but you wouldn't disagree with the description of it. You wouldn't disagree with the description made by Gandhi, made by Martin Luther King, that, we can turn our that we can turn our actual weakness into a moral strength.
I want to jump in and say that I'm not thinking that King, right? I can't say I'll speak for Gandhi, but certainly King. I'm not sure King is at the beginning of that framing, right, the position as a weakness, right? I'm not sure that that's what's going on. I would argue that, and I accept that there's a such thing as strength, right? And I agree with Rick. It's within the context, but I think for King, for example, that the position in which he sees sort of the oppressed United States, that's already a position right, of strength. And it's not sort of this sort of manipulation or this movement. It's just a question of how does one apply and use the strength that's already there within the community or within the community's actions.
What if I use this language instead? We can turn our political powerlessness into a moral power.
No, I'm still going to go with the fact that the power is there. It just has not been sort of properly applied. Right.
But it's definitely not there. It's definitely not that blacks in the 1950s and 60s in the United States were politically empowered.
Well, I mean, formally, no. But if you talk about the type of political engagement.
But that's what I'm trying to say. The only way to contrast that powerlessness with the kind of empowering movement that we saw in, for example, the civil rights movement, or, you know, even just like King's leadership, was to contrast that powerlessness with a moral power that was going to empower.
Well, not just a moral power, but also sort of an organizational power, an activist power, a social power,
right,
a cultural power.
Yeah.
Right.
But
so I guess to go back to what Rick was saying, it's not, it depends on how we're talking about power and the context of that power and the application. So I guess
that's why I'm giving a very specific example, because I really don't think that I honestly, this is just like my honest belief, is that I honestly believe that both of yours resistance to Nietzsche is getting in the way of just seeing that like he does have a very good description. Okay, all right, well,
look, this is my fundamental point, and we could leave it here. And that is, first of all, I don't have a resistance to this. I just don't find it compelling. And the reason why I don't find it compelling is because, as you said at the end of the episode, Lee, or toward the end, there is no description that is not an evaluation. And I evaluate this differently. And so therefore, the description does not have even descriptive power for me, because the values that are embedded in Nietzsche's description are not values I would embed, and therefore the description doesn't have descriptive power.
Yeah, I mean, maybe here, I'm not sure what the it is that when you say the description of it is something with which I don't agree, because I find it very difficult to not agree that popular morality, again, understanding how he describes popular morality, which I think is an accurate description of popular morality even today, is not a morality that, for example, you know, that the kind that we see in the Beatitudes, right? That there's a moral strength in, you know, blessed are the meek, blessed are the poor in spirit, blessed are the persecuted, etc. And that serves as the kind of basis for a morality that protects the weak and the sick and the widows and the orphans and the strangers, etc. That seems to me that is a description. So the question is, how did that come about? And I mean, that's a much longer story.
So right here in the Afterthoughts, we're actually re-dramatizing my frustration. Okay. And that is, I think, Lee, here we're just two ships passing in the night, because I find no reason whatsoever, except maybe for the use of the word meekness. But then, you know, I forget my biblical languages and biblical philology and so on, and I'd like to look at what that word is. But there's no reason I find necessary to look at the Beatitudes with the category strength and weakness. I just don't find it.
No, that's fine. I'm happy to use any other synonyms for strength and weakness.
I don't want to even use a synonym.
Okay. Then we're just like passing in the night. Then I don't know how to. Yeah, I mean, I'd be happy to use, like, I mean, he gives like so many different. I personally use strength and weakness because it seems like the least objectionable of all of them. But I mean, we could use anything else, right? We could use
effective
sick,
and
we could
ineffective.
Use healthy and sick. We could use
effective and ineffective.
We could use effective and ineffective, right? I mean, but I mean, all of those are I mean, it's still going to get us back to the same function of popular morality.
I'm not convinced.
So I'll just jump in really quick, and certainly based upon what my tendencies tend to be, and this speaks to this, some of the examples that we provided during the podcast and during this conversation. Certainly for me, I wish I'd explored more so the connection between the question of sort of the political connection to sort of this idea of popular morality, and also the question of the state or society, right, and stability, right, as such. Like, what are also the ramifications of beginning to make these determinations, these evaluations, as we think about people existing in certain types of desired collective states? So that's probably what I should have inserted more in the actual recording of the podcast, because to me, that's always a fundamental question. And I think some of the bleed that I think Rick and I sort of engaged in, that we've tried not to, but it just, I guess I agree, there's a vortex that was sucking us toward these particular questions. And for me, the inability to not think about the historical context and the conditions under which, right, Nietzsche is writing some of these things, right, leads me to a question of, okay, what type of state, what type of society, right, what type of community, right, are we thinking about as we begin to make these determinations and these evaluations? Right, efficient and inefficient, right?
Yes.
You know, what type of evaluations create an efficient state? What type of evaluations create an inefficient state?
Yeah, I mean, I think that we could have a conversation about what conditions create effective or ineffective or efficient or inefficient states. We would not then be having a question about morality, and that was the topic of the podcast. I mean, you know, again, I actually do agree with what Charles said. I do think that there was a vortex of like what we know about Nietzsche outside of this section that was kind of sucking us away from just working through the account laid out here. But all that said, I mean, you know, it was still a really interesting discussion. I still find that a really persuasive account in that episode. And I think in particular, it is the metaphysics of popular morality that he lays out there, that it does require the fabrication of a particular kind of subject that's free, that can be credited and blamed, that is, that is separable from its actions or behaviors or social embeddedness and all of those sorts of things. That all of that to me is a really important part of understanding how morality works both in the 19th century and even still today in the 21st century.
All right, so before we go, I just want to first apologize to the followers of our Afterthoughts that we have been so derelict in our thinking afterwards this season. But we're going to get better and look forward to more episodes coming fairly soon. And also, again, I know you're all tired of this, but once again, we could really use your support to help defray the costs of the podcast. You could join us at many levels on our Patreon page. That's patreon.com/hotel bar sessions. Find a level with which you're comfortable. And hey, also tell some friends. And if you don't want to tell your friends, just
tell your enemies.
Right, tell your enemies. Tell the weak. Yeah. Tell the weak. Tell the strong.
Tell your friends, tell your enemies. And hey, leave a review on whatever service you subscribe to our podcast on. So as I said, you'll see us again very soon. And this wraps it up for this episode of Hotel Bar Sessions Afterthoughts.
Thanks, guys.
Bye.